Thank you, Senator. My name is Claire Celsey. I live in West Des Moines. I'm here speaking in opposition to this bill. I'm part of a group called Iowans for Public Education. We started in January of 2017 as it became apparent that your party was intent on pretty much underfunding and defunding all matters related to public education. And I just see this as another step in that direction. Unfortunately, you're focusing on the 8% of children that attend private school as opposed to the 92% in the state of Iowa that attend public school. Coupled with the underfunding of schools consistently over the last 10 years, this is going to cause really devastating and disrupting conditions all over the state of Iowa. I can't imagine trying to predict enrollments with this type of legislation in place. I think it will cause significant disruption, and it will also siphon public money from public schools and send it to private schools. I just don't understand how this is in the public's best interest. As far as workforce development goes, we need every student we can get right now. We should be focusing on public schools that provide education for the vast majority of our kids and funding it fully so that it's successful. I am 100% opposed to this legislation, as is almost everyone in my entire group. So I'm just here on their behalf today to stand in opposition to this bill.
Thank you. Is there
Good morning, Senators. My name is Louisa Dykstra. I'm a parent of 2 middle school kids in Windsor Heights, but I'm not here today to advocate for my own kids. I'm one of the volunteer leaders of Parents for Great Iowa Schools, working to preserve Iowa's legacy of strong public schools. I'm also Vice President of the Windsor Heights Chamber of Commerce, so I want to talk about this bill from a workforce perspective. I call this the Anti-Future Ready Iowa bill. So many Iowa business leaders have told us their biggest roadblock to expansion is finding workers with the right education and skills. That should be the focus of our education policy, not spending taxpayer money on religious education. For example, Rick Tollickson, CEO of Hubble Realty, shared this comment with me yesterday. The construction and real estate industry has a huge demand for building trades that require a pre-apprenticeship training program in our high schools. The Skilled Trades Academy in Des Moines Public Schools is one of those programs that needs additional funding to be successful. Our limited taxpayer resources should be spent on programs like these that directly meet workforce needs before expanding to state funding of private schools. Iowa's public schools are working with businesses to meet our biggest needs, like the trades. Taking funds away from public schools to give to private schools makes Iowa's workforce problem worse. In tight budget times, when our public schools are having to make big budget cuts, the last thing we should be doing is starting a new government program to give money to private schools without any of the same rules that public schools are required to follow. Please consider your responsibility to Iowa's future workforce and stop this bill.
Good morning. I'm Connie Ryan, Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and I lobby for the Interfaith Alliance of Iowa Action Fund. Last night I was watching the debate on gun rights. Senator Shelgren, I listened with interest as you read part of the Iowa Constitution, and it made me think about this legislation that we have with us today. I would like to read part of the Iowa Constitution, a part you highlighted last night. Section 3, dealing with religion. The General Assembly shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Nor shall any person be compelled to attend any place of worship, pay tithes, taxes, or other rates for building or repairing places of worship or the maintenance of any minister or ministry. 97% of accredited non-public schools in Iowa are religious institutions. We know they are religious institutions because they say so in their mission and work with clear statements on their websites and in their promotional materials. Religious institutions, by their very definition, are ministry. We also know that they are religious institutions because they may legally opt out of certain laws because of their religious affiliation. They are allowed to teach their religious tenets and beliefs in their institution. They may compel students to be part of religious classes and religious practices, for example, worship during the school day. They may have policies that limit attendance, admittance, and activities based on their religious beliefs. Policies that, in effect, discriminate against students or potential students. They may have policies that limit who they are based on the religious beliefs of the institution, effectively discriminating against employees. Our Civil Rights Code states in the Unfair Employment Practices section, any bona fide religious institution or its educational facility, association, corporation, or society with respect to any qualifications for employment based on religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity, when such qualifications are related to bona fide religious purpose. A religious qualification for instructional personnel or an administrative officer serving in a supervisory capacity of a bona fide religious educational facility or religious institution shall be presumed to be a bona fide occupational qualification. There is additional language in regard to education. We allow for this, Senator, in Iowa law because of our commitment to religious freedom. While these policies are allowed by law, our state's constitution also says we shall not compel Iowans to pay their taxes in support of ministry. By their own statements, non-public schools are religious institutions and are ministry of their faith. It is either religion and ministry, or it is not. They cannot have it both ways. It is also wrong, Senator Shelgren, to take my tax dollars, your tax dollars, our tax dollars, to pay for the mission and ministry of religious institutions, religious ministries, including the ministry in their schools. It is unconstitutional, something about which you and I both care deeply, and we can agree upon. And so I ask for you to oppose Senate Study Bill 3206. Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, I want to thank you for the comments, because when you talk about the Constitution, it's very important. And I appreciate the fact that you read a part of the Constitution. I'd like to go ahead and read the rest of the Constitution to you, which has to do with Section 12, that the Board of Education shall provide the education for all of the youths of the state. And that's why this is an educational savings account going directly for the education of the children at the discretion of the parents. We're not giving money to educational institutions, we're giving money to the parents and letting them decide what the best education should be.
And I would believe the interpretation of that is that the state does provide for all students in our state through our public education system, and people who opt out of that system are doing so by their private choices. And so we do provide for all students. They opt out of that system that we provide for. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kaden Crowe with One Iowa. And One Iowa Action, we represent the LGBTQ community here in the state. I'll follow up on some of Connie's previous comments. The reason that we know that 97% of these institutions are religious is because myself and my team over the last 24 hours poured through the entire accredited non-public school directory looking for all the different kinds of policies that are located in there. So we reviewed about 88% of those institutions had their policies publicly posted. And out of those 88% of institutions, 45% of those institutions had policies that either explicitly discriminate against the LGBTQ community or explicitly reserve the right to discriminate against the LGBTQ community. While they are completely entitled to do that, as was previously mentioned, they have exemptions within the Iowa Civil Rights Act that allow them to exercise their beliefs in that way. We don't believe that taxpayer funding should be propping up this kind of discriminatory behavior. No public school is allowed to engage in this kind of discriminatory behavior, and therefore I would not personally want my tax dollars going toward funding an institution that would discriminate against myself, my friends, my family members, etc. Thanks.
Thank you.
Daniel Zeno, ACLU of Iowa. We oppose Senate Study Bill 3206. As has previously been stated, the majority of private schools in Iowa are religious schools. We believe this will enable discrimination. Under this bill, a non-public school could take taxpayer money and deny admission to almost any student it chooses, based on gender, disability, religious status, economic backgrounds. They could also discriminate against students based on other factors that can contribute to students being more challenging to teach, such as limited English proficiency, history of behavior problems. We also believe that students will lose constitutional rights. When students go to public schools, they have constitutional rights. When students are not in public schools, they lose those rights under Title IX, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Students lose First Amendment rights, due process rights, other constitutional and statutory rights. In fact, it's unfortunate, sometimes parents don't even realize this when they take their voucher and go to a private school, that their students are losing some constitutional rights. Under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, students with disabilities are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. Private schools are not required to do that. Private schools can reject students because they're harder to teach, right? We believe this is not a good bill. We would urge the committee to vote no on the bill and continue to focus on public schools and not fund discrimination.
Good morning, Senators. Melissa Peterson with the Iowa State Education Association. We are registered strongly against this proposed legislation. I struggle with the title of this piece of legislation that's being proposed, the Iowa Student Opportunity Act. I believe that we have a strong history here in the state of Iowa of making sure that we fulfill our responsibility to the many, not just the few. And I think we have done that very well through our public education system that serves more than 480,000 students across the state, regardless of what their county demographic might look like. For those that think that we might not have options, please know that our public educators go out of their way to understand that one size does not fit all. And legislators understand that one size does not fit all, which is why, under current code, we have access to quality public schools. We have access to public charter schools. We have access to magnet schools. We have access to concurrent enrollment programs, right, that provide us with lots of different flexibility and options under our existing public school structure. For those families, approximately 34,000 students who choose to opt out of that public school program, as a state, we also subsidize that non-public education to the tune of approximately $44 million currently. Right? So I would argue we provide plenty of options for those folks who decide to choose things that are not in the public school track. I think it's very important for us to understand that if we were able to come up with additional resources, which, by the way, this legislative session I have repeatedly been told are very, very scarce. You all took action last night to pass a de-appropriation bill for our existing fiscal year to the tune of $35 million, right? So I did not realize there were apparently additional dollars to be able to be spent on creating a tandem system that would be subsidized by taxpayer dollars. If we are able to find such resources, I would strongly advocate that those resources be designated to benefit the nearly 500,000 public school students, as opposed to the approximately 34,000 current non-public students. Now, I appreciate this bill does not apply to those that are currently enrolled in a private school. However, we have an estimate of approximately $15 million in the first year just to gear up, I believe. There hasn't been a fiscal note requested on this, but it is somewhat similar to the original piece of legislation, Senate File 2091, that you had proposed at the beginning of the legislative session. So we can quibble over how much it would be until we have an official fiscal note. But if we're paying for every new, potentially, kindergartner who enters the system to have this $4,000 per pupil funding amount for them, and then anyone who is not previously enrolled in the prior 2 semesters in a non-public school, this could have a price tag upwards of $10 million. To get into the logistical questions that I have related to the bill that I was hoping I might be able to get answered today, I'm concerned about the cost of the Department of Management contracting with a private vendor to manage the program. I also have questions as to whether or not students who would be eligible for the $4,000 voucher, if they'd also be eligible to receive the school tuition organization grants that currently exist in our state code. I also then would ask, what would be the potential expense if, as has been proposed in the Republican tax reform proposal here in the Senate, we couple with the federal government's tax reform proposal to expand our current 529 college savings program to apply to K-12 non-public education. There was an estimate from our treasurer's office before this piece of legislation was proposed that just that coupling with the 529 program would cost our state $5 to $8 million in revenue. When we take that into consideration, with the potential tens of millions of dollars that the $4,000 per pupil would apply to, and then, by the way, there also was a proposal in the Republican tax reform legislation that the Senate has moved forward that would increase that STO cap, by the way, for $1 million. It also would increase the eligibility to receive one of those grants from 300% of the federal poverty rate to 400% of the federal poverty rate, which, by the way, would mean that a family of 4 making $96,000 a year would qualify for one of these grants and potentially also qualify for the $4,000 voucher. That is an incredible expense. If we have the resources to move forward with something like this, please consider, instead of investing in a very small pool of people, by the way, many of these individuals, we approximate about 1/5 of our existing public school population, by the way, would not directly benefit from this voucher plan because they don't have non-public schools in their counties. Right? So this isn't about access for all. If you want to protect access for all, I believe we should make additional investments in the public education system. And if for some reason none of those reasons are compelling to you, please also consider the lack of accountability and transparency that I believe exists in our non-public school system. We have some quality institutions. However, they do not have to accept all students as public schools do. Additionally, they do not have locally, democratically elected boards that monitor their expenditure of resources. For all of these reasons, I sincerely hope that you are able to find it within yourselves to truly look out for access and student opportunity for all students. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there someone else who'd like to speak in favor of the bill? All right, seeing none. Next.
I'm Brian Carter. I represent the Iowa Conference of the United Methodist Church, and we are very definitely against this bill. We are against it because we believe in public education. We work with our schools throughout the state. There's probably a Methodist church in every school district, and we cooperate as partners. We're partnering together to make sure that our children receive the best education they possibly can. And this bill, as it takes away resources from our public education system, I know you said that it probably shouldn't, but it does a little bit, and it could. We aren't against choice, but we do want our children to have the very best as possible. One area of concern that I've noticed in my few years up here at the Hill is that we haven't really funded the preschool education fully throughout the state. And the preschool makes a difference. Early education, I know this doesn't have to do with that, but I am talking about resources and how we best use our resources. In addition to the importance of the life of the individual, education is also a key ingredient in the well-being of society. That's why the state has the responsibility to provide public education for all. According to the research by Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, education level correlates to life expectancy, civic engagement, and economic stability. So this is very important to the life of our every community, every small town, every county in our state, and I hope that you would be consider this as you consider this option.
Thank you. Next.
Oops. Good morning. Margaret Buckton with the Urban Education Network and the Rural School Advocates of Iowa. Both are registered opposed to the bill. First, I just want to clear up two technicalities. There was a statement made earlier that the $4,000 of local money stays with the district. That is not true with this bill because the student is not counted in the enrollment of the district. So to clear that up. Secondly, I'm also a member of the Windsor Heights Chamber of Commerce, and I don't believe the question was whether or not the private school graduates were workforce ready. The statement that was made was that if we have limited resources, they ought to be invested in programs such as the Academy in Des Moines that's going to improve workforce readiness for those students that are most in need. We already have a competitive school environment. We have more than 60,000 students that either open enroll to a neighboring public school, that attend a private school. That doesn't count the students that are going to the open enrollment academies, the online academies that are supported by private businesses, or students that are homeschooled, because we no longer count those students. So we have lots of school choice in Iowa. We also have choice within school districts where parents can choose the program that's most fitting for their student. We already invest over $53 million in private school opportunities for students. There will be expansion of that if the two tax proposals move forward as they increase the amount in the school tuition organization tax credits and the 529 plans. The rural school districts are most concerned at two things that happen. There was a map that was part of a report by your Department of Revenue about the tuition tax credits that showed the location of private schools in the state. The whole southern tier of Iowa has hardly any, which means that this does not provide a benefit to parents in terms of school choice, but likely would restrict the amount of resources available for public schools. And those rural schools are working really hard to meet accreditation requirements, provide great programs for students, and stay financially secure. Just two other things. There's no public oversight of the expenditures at the private school level, and there's no level playing field, both in terms of admissions policy, of keeping students in school, of accepting all students, and the requirements that you have of public schools to make sure that that investment is making a return on investment for the taxpayer, such as the state assessment, such as making sure that those students are getting the reading support early on with the FAST assessments. None of those are required for the non-public schools either. So from an accountability standpoint, taxpayers ought to know that their dollars are making a difference. Thank you for listening today and for enjoying this conversation.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm John Cacciatore. I represent the Des Moines Public Schools. We educate over 30,000 students here in central Iowa, which rivals the size of Iowa State University. We're opposed to this bill. And there are a number of reasons, but for sake of time, I'm only going to mention three. Taxpayer rules and transparency must follow the child. Public schools are funded by Iowa taxpayers, whether they have children attending school or not, and taxpayers have the right to expect those non-public schools who choose to accept public funds, whether it's through the parent or otherwise, to follow the same rules of attendance and transparency requirements of public schools. And make no mistake about it, non-public schools under this bill, they choose what students they'll take. Secondly, Iowa performs better than any other state with ESAs. Governor Reynolds cited data with Iowa ranked 8th in the nation in education. The 6 states with ESAs ranked between 21st and 49th. Why would we want to follow that kind of path? Third, ESAs do not address rural Iowans' concerns, as some have said. More than 76,000 Iowa students today have no private school option in their county to even use an ESA. They can't afford to have tax dollars taken away from their community schools to fund non-public schools in other areas. Most Iowans just want to improve their community schools and prepare their children to work in the workforce of the future. Thank you, Senators.
Thank you.
Hi, I am Morgan Miller with AFSCME Council 61. We represent many school support staff around the state. This includes school bus drivers, administrative staff, and teachers' aides. And over the last 10 years, these have been the folks who have been cut in school districts due to meager SSA funding coming in. So we cannot support any legislation that would divert tax revenue to private institutions while we're not first meeting our commitment to our public schools. And I'd also like to echo Melissa Peterson's comments that we must remind ourselves we're dealing with state budget issues. We have continued to dip into our reserves. Last night we just cut another 35 million from the state budget for mid-year cuts. We did the same thing last year to the tune of 118 million. This is not the time to do this. This is dangerous and irresponsible to our state budget, and we are very much against this piece of legislation.
My name is Carl Schilling. I'm with the Iowa United Professionals / United Electrical Workers. We represent human service workers in state government, as well as civil rights workers and some science units. You've heard the data. I think it's compelling. I'm here opposed to this bill, but I thought I'd give a personal note. When I was a boy, which was some time ago, I recently turned 65, even more recently 72. And I had an unusual situation back then in that my father was a self-employed carpenter, and finding no work in Iowa in the wintertime, we would go south for the winters, which means that I would spend 3 months in Iowa schools, 3 months either in Texas, California, Florida, and then come back and finish the school year in Iowa. As disruptive as this was, it did give me quite a bit of insight into comparative schools. And frankly, I could just as well have been sick during the winter, because Iowa schools were so much ahead of the schools in other states that I went to. Sometimes I would be an assistant teacher because those kids were a couple years behind, and we just did better in Iowa. Because of that, the better schools in Iowa, and because I went to a land-grant school with inexpensive tuition, I was able to get a college education and incidentally marry above myself. So much of the life that I have had depended on the fact that Iowa had and still has a great public school system. So it breaks my heart to see it eroding. College is way more expensive. Public schools are dying for funding. We aren't number one anymore. We used to vie with Wisconsin and Minnesota. Now we don't. We're further down the line and getting further down. And the resources, and what has happened to teachers, making it less of a good place for teachers to work in Iowa, has also damaged it. And now we have a decision to take money from somewhere, either public education or the very strained state budget, and fund it for school choice, which they have always had. They've always had the choice. They just didn't, we just don't need to subsidize that choice, I don't believe. Things are straight now. They're going to be worse. The revenue is going to be less if the income tax is cut. We're very likely facing a trade war with China. All of these things are converging together, and I don't think we dare take that kind of money for this bill and put it away. We need it now for other purposes. We're going to need it even more in the future. And so I hope that you vote this down. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Pat Stalter. I've been an Iowan my whole life. I am a product of a public school in South Central Iowa. It gave me everything I needed to go on to college, and it's been my pride to be a public educator in Iowa, retiring after 43 years. That's over 4 decades. I don't ever remember a time in my teaching when the public didn't respect what I was doing and what my colleagues were doing, and nobody tried to undermine it. I'll tell you just a quick story. My mom and dad, I was raised in what could have been a contentious household. My dad couldn't have been a more staunch Republican, and my mother couldn't have been a more staunch Democrat. But they worked hard, they bought land, they paid taxes on it, and they raised me to believe that taxes aren't a bad thing. They are an investment in the public good, in the common good. And my dad was one of the first ones who said, our kids are raised, but we need a new high school. My vote and my wife's vote are for it. I'm just saying that this proposed legislation and other things like it that suggest that parents and their children can't get what they need from public education sounds like a very privileged group of people. The $4,000 in grants won't pay, probably won't pay. I don't have the money. They don't, I mean, the statistics won't pay for them to go to the private school that they wanted to go to. But it will cancel out whatever money that child might have had in the public schools. Now, I did grow up close enough to Des Moines that we had a few students who went to Dowling or St. Joseph's, and they got a good education too. But their parents didn't ask, my tax-paying parents, to pay for that, and they didn't ask for a tax break so that they could send their kids where it was a choice. I don't understand the logic of this, and as a taxpayer who has always proudly paid my taxes because it's an investment in the common good and in future and hope, I say we don't spend tax dollars on non-tax supported and non-public entities. Thank you very much.
My name is Angelica Terrapin. I'm with the Child and Family Policy Center, and we are opposed this bill, and I think we support everything everybody else has said about why they oppose this bill, but I think we also oppose it because it's not, we talk a lot about parent choice, but it's not true choice. For many families, this is not going to make a difference. I heard that, well, if family wants this and they want to put their child in a private school, they can just drive them in the morning. For some families, they don't have the resources, so it's not really a choice. So what it does, and I think the previous speaker talked about, it is a privilege. If you want to put your children, if you have the funding to do it, great. I think private schools do have a role, but for many families, it's way out of their league, and this only leaves them in communities with less funding in their schools. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Rose Green. I'm a mother, a wife, a small business owner, and someone who moved to Iowa to raise my family and give my children our nationally recognized Iowa education. Senate Study Bill 3206 will reduce transparency to taxpayers. It has been shown to not improve outcomes, and it will further destabilize our rural schools. I know that a lot of this is repetitive to what you're hearing, but I wanted to still stand up here as a parent and a small business owner and give you my opinion from that perspective. I organize a group called Parents for Great Iowa Schools, and we've spent a lot of time over this legislative session visiting towns throughout Iowa, urban, rural. We have connected personally with hundreds of public school parents. And my biggest concern here is that we talk about choice. And should we be talking about choice, or should we be talking about student achievement and student outcomes? Because my biggest concern is that I keep hearing that this is about parent choice and that the student achievement data is there. I would really, really, really like to see that, because from what I am seeing from across the board, I would love to see a nonpartisan organization provide information on student achievement, and I would hope that you would look into that and consider that before you move forward with this study bill 3206. Thank you.
Brad Hetz with ISA, and we're sorry for the second time, but I wanted to close on a school finance 101. And a couple of your previous speakers brought this up. I want to make sure we're clear on this. We don't count non-public school students except for AEA services in our school finance count. So we don't tax the parents of homeschooled students or private schooled students in our school finance formula. Because of that, a lot of folks have thought, well, 40% of the per pupil amount will be left behind. Well, there's no 40% to be left behind. Margaret Buckton covered that. We made that choice long ago not to count these students in there. So they've never been taxed. These parents have never been taxed, so They're just like you and I. If I don't like paying at the public golf course, I pay for it. Same choice is available here for them. So I want to make that clear. The other thing I want to make clear is we gave schools 1% SSA this year. That put 185 school districts on the budget guarantee. 55%. We don't understand the budgeting process. We know on the revenue side, we're talking about tax cuts. On this side, we're talking about giving more money to non-public schools. So I just want to be clear on School Finance 101. These students have never generated any tax dollars, and this money has to come from somewhere, and we aren't really clear where you're going to get that from. But we just want to make sure in the School Finance Forum you understood that. So thank you.
So thank you, Senator Shelgren. Thank you to the speakers. So you know that I'm an adjunct professor, teach public policy every once in a while when I get invited back to the University of Northern Iowa, and I would give this bill 3 Fs. First F is that it's a false choice. As you've heard the speakers talk about the premises of the bill, that it creates choice. The reality is it does create unequal opportunities for the students who could take advantage of it versus those that can't. And while there are students of disabilities and other socioeconomic status who would take advantage of this, that's a choice. There's no requirement that those schools have to provide that. So I think that's the false premise behind the false choice. The other F that I would give it is I think this is fiscally irresponsible. We still do not know what the final budget for fiscal year 19 will be. We do know that in the last 8 years, we have seen the lowest amount of increase for K-12 education in the history of the school funding formula. My friends on the other side of the aisle like to talk about the overall amount, the real dollar amount, but the reality is, adjusted for inflation, it has been the lowest investment in 8 years in Iowa history. And this is what we're talking about, K-12 education and the investment in it. This bill would further erode that investment for the reasons that have been stated here. So I think it's fiscally irresponsible. The final F that I would give it, I think, is the most important F. It fails the Iowa fairness test. So I represent what I like to call, self-described, the education capital of Iowa. It begins with the University of Northern Iowa's teacher training program, a long tradition and history of creating the best teachers in the world. That's why it was called the Iowa State Teachers College, now the University of Northern Iowa. So that's the core, that's the heart. That's the community center of the Cedar Valley. And then from there, I have every other form of education known to Iowans. Public, nonprofit, private, all the way from early childhood to advanced graduate degrees. And we find a way in the Cedar Valley to balance these issues. And I think this type of proposal creates divisions among Iowans that are not necessary. Speakers have talked about the choice that is already inherent in the Iowa system. Some speakers have argued that there should be zero investment in non-public schools for constitutional reasons. But Iowa has found a way to actually balance that question. And we do provide, probably more so than other states, investment in non-public schools that have found a way to balance the two. And I think for those 3 reasons, this bill deserves an F. It creates a false choice, it's fiscally irresponsible, and I think it fails the Iowa fairness test about the kind of policies that we would propose to solve some problems. What would I do? Perhaps look at the open enrollment law in Iowa, provide greater flexibility there. If parents feel that that law has restricted them from being able to go to other places, perhaps you find an independent board or somewhere else at the local level that would vet those decisions so those parents could actually find a way to do that. I have supported the STOW program, voted for it. It's a way for families to set aside some money and find a way to achieve a choice. But they've all of those choices in the past have balanced the basic Iowa fairness test about a quality education for everybody. And I just don't think this bill does that. And so I want to make sure that people were aware of that. I'll be opposing the bill and will not be signing the subcommittee report.